How to sew Amber Makes Scrappy Spiral Mats. Make these beautiful mats or coasters using all of your scraps. Follow me and I'll show you how. Starting off. Start by choosing the fabric that you want to use for your mat. You can use a mixture of colours, just one colour or print, or just choose some random colours that you want to go together. Put them in the order that you'd like to place them. You'll also need some cotton rope. We used a 1/4 inch diameter cotton rope, which you can buy from hardware stores or online, and this is ideal for your mat. You're going to need a lot of thread, so choose one that coordinates with your fabric. The instructions tell you how much fabric and rope you will need to make the mat the size you want. So start by cutting all the fabric into 1-inch strips and place them all into a pile like this. Again, refer to the instructions to give you a rough idea of how many strips and fabric you're going to need and how much rope to make the size of mat you want to do. So put them all into strips in piles, and then they're easy to access and get hold of when you're making your mat. I'm putting mine all in order here just to make it simpler for when I'm constructing the mat, and then I can just pick up each strip in the order I want them when I'm making it. You could always cut more strips later as you go. Wrapping the rope. Take the first fabric strip that you want to put in the centre of your mat. Fold one short end over by 1/2 inch to the wrong side and place the end of the rope on top of the folded end like this, so it's in the centre. Now fold the fabric strip over on top of the rope. I'm folding it from the left-hand side and then folding over the top. This just means that the end of the rope will be encased inside your fabric strip. Now put a pin in just to hold this in place. You can take it out later, but it just holds it in place while you're doing the wrapping. And then carefully at the beginning, wrap the rope so it goes over the strip, so it goes over that folded end to make it neat. And then you can continue wrapping the strip around the rope. The fabric strip needs to overlap itself enough to cover the rope, but not too much or it will be too bulky. You'll find this easier as you go along and as you practice, but you can see here that I'm making sure that I'm overlapping the end of the fabric strip with the next bit, but I'm not doing it too much. I found it easier to wrap the strips around the rope if I held the rope taut. So what I did was I tied the rope to something, or you can clip it to the edge of a work surface or tie it to a chair, because if the rope is taut, it's easier to wrap the fabric strip. So the end is a little bit fiddly, but once you get further along, you can see you just continue wrapping and overlapping the strip over the rope all the way along. You can see I'm overlapping the fabric strip by about 1/2 inch, but you'll find as you do it that it will just become natural. It will just overlap as it wants to. So just make sure that there are no pleats or lumps or bumps as you're wrapping, but don't overthink it. This is supposed to be a scrappy spiral mat, and when you sew it together, any little extra lumps or bumps or creases will disappear in the stitching. So work all the way along to the end. And when you get to the end, just pin it into place to hold it. So you can see I've got it pinned into place at one end and then at the other end. Or if you prefer, this is what I like to do, I use a fabric clip because it's just easier to take in and out when you join in the next strip. And that's how to wrap the rope. Stitching the coil. To start stitching, fold the fabric bound end of the rope over by about 1/2 inch and then wind it round into a coil. For the starting end, we're going to put pins in to hold it into place. As you get further on with your mat, you won't need these pins, but to start off, you need to hold them in place. So just wrap a couple of rows like this and then push some pins through from one part of the fabric bound rope to the other, as you can see here, and this will just hold them in place. So I'm putting these pins in about every inch or so, 1/2 inch, it just depends, but you want to just hold it together for about 2 or 3 rows so that you can get started. So as you can see, the end that you started with is going to be in the centre of the mat. And you now need to stitch this together. To set your sewing machine to a zigzag. The instructions will give you more details about this, but you will need to zigzag from one side of the rope to the other, so where the next part of the coil joins on. So when you start with, you're going to have to pivot and move quite often. So make sure that your zigzag is wide enough so it goes from one fabric bound rope to the other in the next round of the coil, and then pivot and turn so that you are always making sure you go from one to the other. You can experiment with the length and width of your zigzag just to make sure it goes from one coil to the other. So you don't want it too big or too small. So as you can see here, because I've put the pins in place, it makes it much easier. I'm not having to deal with coiling the rope at the same time, particularly in the start. So when you start off, this is what it looks like. I'm just taking it out to show you. You can see now that I've worked the zigzags from one coil to the other, and then I can remove the pins that I've placed in to hold that. Now you will obviously need to join in more fabric strips. You can do this before you start stitching, but I wanted to show you the stitching first. This is really simple to do. You just underlap, place one strip underneath the end of the last strip, and then just wrap it round. Try to make sure that when you wrap it round, that the next fabric strip covers the end of the last one. You can use a pin to hold that in place. Don't worry if you've got little ends sticking up like that, because when you do the machine zigzagging, that will hold them down. So once you've done the end, you just continue wrapping in this way. Now it's easier if you wrap your whole rope, if you wrap quite a lot of it before you start, or you can wrap it as you go. Particularly if you want to be sure of colour placement and how many rounds you have of each colour. And then all you need to do is just coil it round again and sew it together in exactly the same way as you did before. But this time, when you're coiling it, you won't need the pins, because as the mat gets bigger, you can coil and stitch as you go. So you can see here, this is another way of joining in the strips. You can sew them together. I've sewed them diagonally. This just means that it's easier when you're wrapping in the next strip. So you can either underlap them like I did, or you can sew them together. And I've just sewn them together with the machine zigzags. That's what was set on my machine. That just makes it a little bit easier to fold them round, because you haven't got to catch one end underneath the other. So it's entirely up to you whichever method you want to use. So you could join all your strips together, but you need to have a look at the arrangement. You might want to just go really random, and with your first mat I would, but if you want to make sure that you've got the same number of fabrics in each coil, obviously the coils get bigger and bigger as the mat gets bigger, so you'll need more of the same colour fabric. But for your first mat, just join in whatever strips you want, and then you will soon understand and practice the process, and then you can do your colour arrangement with your next one. So you can see you've got a really neat join there. Now, if your mat is going to be bigger than your sewing machine throat, depending on how big you're going to make it, you need to stitch it together so the stitch part is to the left of the needle, because obviously your sewing machine throat may limit it. But don't worry if you start off with it to the right. This mat is double-sided. You can just flip it over, and when your mat gets too big, you can just turn it over and work on the other side. It's just because obviously the space is unlimited to the left of the needle, but it is limited by the throat of your sewing machine to the right of the needle. And then you just continue zigzagging, but always making sure that your needle goes into one coil and into the other coil. And as you can see here, as the mat gets bigger like this, you don't need pins anymore. You just coil it as you go. Now, if you need to join lengths of rope, this is really easy. Use a washi tape or a micropore tape and just place one end on one side and the other on the other. Make sure they butt up, but don't actually overlap. And then just fold the tape round it. Because if they overlap, you will have bulk. So this is just the tape is merely to secure it in place. It's just to hold it together, because once you wrap it with your fabric strip like this will secure it properly, and also with the machine zigzag it will hold it as well. So the tape is just to hold them butting together. Finishing off. When you come to the end of the rope in your fabric strip, when you decide you want your mat to finish, place a pin where you want the end of it to be, and then unwrap the fabric strip all the way down to where that point is. So with this one, I'm making a coaster. So I'm stopping where I want it to be just the right size for the coaster. And then just hold the fabric strip in place just a bit further below that, just to stop it coming undone any further. Next, cut the rope exactly where you want the mat to finish. Then trim the fabric strip so it's about 1/2 inch longer than the end of the rope. Now wrap the strip back round the end of the rope, fold the end under by about 1/2 inch, and then fold it over on top of the end of the rope in exactly the same way as you did when you started. So you fold it over the top and round, and place a pin to hold that in place. Now you can finish stitching the coil into place. So I've got a pin that's holding the turned over edge into place, and then put a pin or clip to hold the end, and then just continue your zigzag stitching. And then it will look like this, and that's the end is all covered because you folded it over, so you've got a nice neat end. Now you will find that you've got frayed thread ends if you've started and finished your stitching, but also you'll have several frayed fabric ends because obviously you've used raw edges of fabric. So I would give it a little trim all over, so it's like giving it a little haircut. So just pull out the fabric threads that are loose and give it a little trim all over. But don't worry too much about this, because you will find as the mat or the coaster gets more and more use, these threads will just flatten and disappear. But to start with, just to remove the extra ones, I just give it a little trim all over and you'll just get a neater finish. But don't worry too much. Again, this is a Scrappy spiral mat and those threads will flatten after a while. So there's the coaster all finished. And here's the matching placemat that I made as well. And you can see I've done it with the fabric all in the order I wanted them to be, and with the same fabrics in each spiral. Your mats are now ready to use.